afternoon, boa tarde a todos. We're starting our next section in the conference series, Philosophy and Visual Arts. Today with the conference from Dr. Robert Farrugia from University of Malta. Vamos começar a próxima sessão, boa tarde a todos, do nosso ciclo de conferências, Filosofia e Artes Visuais, hoje com a conferência do Dr. Robert Farrugia. So, Robert, just a little presentation. Robert holds a BA in Philosophy, Master in Contemporary Western Philosophy, and also a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Malta. The PhD was obtained in 2024 with his doctoral research focused on the theme of interiority and the 20th century. His primary academic interests encompass phenomenology, existentialism, personalism, and philosophy of religion, with a particular emphasis on issues such as compassion, community, inwardness, affectivity, and transformation. Specializing in contemporary French phenomenology, especially the works of Michel Henry, Dr. Farrugia further refined his expertise through attendance in, for instance, 2015 Summer School in Phenomenology and Philosophy of Mind at the Center for Subjectivity Research at the University of Copenhagen, as well as participation in various local and international conferences in locations such as Paris and Porto. He is a casual lecturer at University of Malta, and today he will hold the conference, The Image of the Invisible. So now the same in Portuguese for those who do not understand. English. Robert Farrugia possui um bacharelado com honras em filosofia, um mestrado em filosofia ocidental contemporânea e um doutorado em filosofia pela Universidade de Malta. Doutorado este obtido em 2024, com a sua pesquisa focada no tema da interioridade no contexto do século XX. Seus principais interesses acadêmicos abrangem fenomenologia, existencialismo, personalismo e filosofia da religião, com ênfase particular em questões como compaixão, comunidade, interioridade, afetividade e transformação. Especializado em fenomenologia francesa contemporânea, especialmente nas obras de Michel Henry, Dr. Farrugia aprimorou ainda mais sua expertise por meio de participação, por exemplo, na Escola de Verão de 2015 sobre fenomenologia e filosofia da mente no Centro de Pesquisa sobre Subjetividade da Universidade de Copenhagen, bem como em diversas conferências locais e internacionais, como Paris e Porto. Ele é professor casual em ocasiões, no caso, na Universidade de Malta, e hoje apresentará a conferência A Imagem do Invisível. So, Robert, thank you very much for your presence, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this invitation and also for this brilliant idea of bringing all these different ideas and speakers together. Thank you also very much for those joining us for this presentation. Let me just start with a bit of an introduction before I jump into the text. So I will be starting this talk basically with a bit of a long introduction to phenomenology, which I think is very important and useful for this talk, because it is there where the question of art in the 20th century perhaps is brought to question, and especially in relation to this image of the invisible, which I will be talking more about. Here we have a kind of a new concept of art which moves beyond the object, the imitation, the decorative art, and towards more of a art as an event or as an encounter. I will also be, by the end of this talk, making reference to different philosophers, but also examples from art history, ranging from the classical, medieval, Renaissance and the modern. Ultimately, my main idea is to make a bit clearer the distinction between these two categories, the idol and the icon, which I think are very central here and precisely is what this talk is about. So the talk is titled The Image of the Invisible, and I hope that by the end of this talk, the title will be a bit more clearer. So I'll start reading the text which I prepared. I'm also told that there is a translation, so I invite you to follow, please. In this presentation, I aim to share insights on the phenomenology of art and examine what can be meant by the image of the invisible. I will present this 20th century philosophical approach and some of its contributions to current debates surrounding art. My main aim is to capture the significance of engaging with the image, which does not confine us to idolatry, and hence to a singular space which purports to define one single reality, that is, the view from the world of visibility and the object. Such a reduction to the visible means that nothing else can be given to us except through the mediation of the world. Instead, I hope this presentation will open us to the icon of a living image of the invisible given to us from elsewhere, beyond the visible limitations. I'll start my first quote here by a very famous 20th century philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, from his work titled Sense and Nonsense, and an essay specifically there titled Cézanne's Doubt. This is what he writes in this essay. Art is not imitation, nor is it something manufactured according to the wishes of instinct or good taste. It is a process of expressing, not a trompe-l'œil. So what is a trompe-l'œil? The term is French for deceiving the eye. It refers to the ability to represent objects with such realism that they confuse the viewer about their material reality. What is at stake here is the question of what art should be, or perhaps what it should do. Is art merely a matter of imitating and representing what is seen? In this sense, then, the good artist possesses the skill to copy the physical world effectively. However, Merleau-Ponty and many others in the phenomenological tradition offer a turn towards the expressive. In this context, we move beyond a correspondence theory of truth that links the artwork to the natural world toward a kind of truth that is revealed to us. This is another quote by another 20th century philosopher working within this phenomenological tradition. His name is Michel Henry. I'll be reading this quote from the slide here. So it goes as follows. The question of the meaning of the work of art can only be tackled if one first resolves the question of its nature, or as we say, its site. So it is a question of knowing which dimension of being the aesthetic object arises and what status it should be recognized to have for the entire content of the specific experience known as art. The question of the work of art's meaning serves as a way for us to receive what it gives and communicates. Michel Henry, forming part of this phenomenological tradition, allows us to investigate which dimension of being the aesthetic object arises in order to attend to it. Henry passed away in 2002 and wrote extensively on philosophical related subjects, including politics, technology, religion, ethics, but also art. In fact, his most famous work on art is titled Seeing the Invisible, published in 1988. Here, in Seeing the Invisible, Henry makes an important distinction between the dimension of the visible and the invisible, which is central to his whole philosophical project. The visible dimension is the space where things are given to us in the world's light as external phenomena, that is, as objects. On the other hand, the invisible dimension is the space where, before the emergence of the world's horizon of exteriority and objectification that puts everything at a distance from us and offers it as an object to us, we encounter an expression of life as intimate and immediate. Now, very interestingly, parallel to this tradition, and very much in tandem with it, John Berger's book, Ways of Seeing, is one of the most stimulating and influential books on art in the 20th century. It was first published in 1972 and originally aired as a BBC television series. What is presented here is the crucial relation between what we see and what we know. This issue has been taken very seriously in the last century within the philosophical school known as phenomenology, which I have been mentioning so far without providing much detail about its nature. So now I turn to the question of what is phenomenology. Phenomenology posits that the world is more than it appears to us. Its main interest centers upon a general critical reflection on the relationship between the subjectivity of knowing and the objectivity of the content known. At the dawn of the 20th century, Edmund Husserl, an Austrian-German philosopher and mathematician, called for a new fundamental science, which he calls pure phenomenology, which he believed was equally rigorous in method as all the other modern sciences. He identifies this new philosophy as a fundamental science of origins, an urgent call for all philosophical and scientific disciplines to be rooted within it to obtain their proper force and status. This becomes possible by adopting what he calls the transcendental attitude, which in turn exposes this invisible dimension. Husserl's primary concern is that we go about our day-to-day lives accepting one single spatio-temporal reality. He refers to this outlook as the natural attitude. In this attitude, we naively consent that the world is merely present out there as an object, whereby we encounter its presence without thematizing it, and hence without investigating the modes of appearance that structure subjectivity. Husserl claims that a radical shift of attitude is required from the meditating philosopher's end. For Husserl, phenomenology is the gate of entry to genuine knowledge of self and of the world. Now, phenomenology seeks to move, as a 20th century philosophy school, beyond the limits of modernism and its mistrust of the self and the world, from which we inherit this outlook of deep suspicion. What is given in experience to the modern mind is a representation, idealized or constructed by the mind. In turn, we end up investigating the world as separate from us, in Husserl's words, in the natural attitude. The shift phenomenology brings is a return to the things themselves as they are given to us in experience in their plentitude and intensity. By recovering this trust, the world itself is given to us, and through phenomenology, we can investigate its different modes of givenness. In turn, phenomenology seeks to redefine philosophy as an extensive and far-reaching investigation of life by encompassing the social, political, spiritual, artistic, and cultural spheres. And as a result, phenomenology reopens the notion of experience, incorporating themes such as the sacred, the aesthetic, perception, language, and the body. This means that for phenomenologists, conscious experience is a multifaceted and rich sphere where various acts such as believing, loving, hoping, feeling, willing, imagining, perceiving, sensing, remembering, attending, anticipating, and all other mental activities are accomplished. It is the space within which the meaning of such act is revealed. The phenomenological attitude views the subject as an active participant engaged in the knowledge they hold, as they can act on it. This means the subject actively searches, discovers, and utilizes the discovery. In this sense, knowing is viewed as an activity rather than merely a means to access an external reality. To this end, phenomenology aims to liberate experiences from the clutches of the externalist view. Thus, phenomenological epistemology articulates experience from the standpoint of the experiencer, the human being, that is, by describing our subjective ways of accessing objects while being mindful of the structure of meaning we use, even though we tend to take those for granted. In this sense, phenomenology should be seen as an attempt to reverse the project of the Age of Reason, whereby this model, the letter, the Age of Reason, remodels philosophy into the image of natural science. In turn, Enlightenment thinkers equate being human with the capacity to objectify the world, with the intent of gaining mastery of it, and eventually exercising instrumental control. Visibility, then, is given absolute primacy. Now, phenomenology as a philosophical method centers on the conscious experience of phenomena as they appear, emphasizing how we live through and make sense of the world in our immediate subjective experience, right? So, for example, when applied to time, unlike the naturalistic view, phenomenology reveals that it is not merely an objective sequence of moments measured by clocks and calendars, but a lived, flowing dimension of consciousness. Husserl introduced the idea of internal time consciousness, which describes how we experience the passage of time through retention, the immediate past, that is, primal impression, the vivid present, and protension, the future that is anticipated. This triadic structure underscores that we are never in a single isolated now, but instead our consciousness constantly synthesizes past, present, future into a unified, ongoing lived experience. Thinkers such as Heidegger, for example, or Maurice Merleau-Ponty further deepen our understanding of lived time. Heidegger, for example, emphasized that our being is always oriented towards the future, what he calls this condition of being towards death. Merleau-Ponty, on the other hand, highlights the emphasis of the body and perceptual aspects of temporality, how time is felt in our gestures, our fatigue, and our anticipation. Thus, phenomenology opens a path to seeing time not just as something we observe or measure, but as something we subjectively inhabit. It draws attention to the richness of temporality as it is lived, how waiting, for example, stretches a moment, how joy collapses hours into seconds, how memory and expectation continually shape our sense of now. Just to take one example here, listening to a melody beautifully illustrates this concept of lived time and internal time consciousness. We do not perceive each note in isolation when we hear a melody, as if each sound were a separate, disconnected event. Instead, we experience the melody as a flowing, meaningful whole. This is because our consciousness retains the just past notes, holds the present note in focus, and anticipates the notes to come. In this way, the experience of the melody unfolds through a temporal structure that our consciousness actively synthesizes, allowing us to perceive a coherent musical phrase rather than a series of static notes. This musical experience shows that time is not something external that we merely observe, confined to a space of visibility. It is rather something we live through in a structured and intentional way. The past then lingers in our awareness without being fully present. The future is already implicitly shaping our expectations, and the present is always slipping into the past. This interplay forms the temporal horizon of lived experience. In other words, the melody becomes meaningful because our consciousness is temporally extended. It holds on to the past, lives in the present, and leans into the future all at once. This is the essence of phenomenological time, not a sequence of nows, but a dynamic, continuous flow of experience. Now, perhaps to help us understand better how important and significant phenomenology is to the 20th century, but even ongoing today, I'd just like to share these two quotes by one of the pioneers, a contemporary to Husserl, Max Scheler. He writes, "The phonological philosopher, thirsting for the lived experience of being, will above all seek to drink at the very sources in which the contents of the world reveal themselves." And the more recent philosopher writes that phenomenology is the study of human experience and of the way things present themselves to us and through such experience. More recently, in 2018, Emmanuel Falk, a French Catholic theologian and philosopher whose work synthesizes medieval theology, philosophy of religion, and French phenomenology, made the following statement about the enduring fascination with phenomenology. And this is a quote from an article he wrote. The attractiveness of phenomenology in France, but also in the United States, comes from its capacity for crossing different fields and its capacity for returning to our lived experience. Phenomenology attempts to be near to things, near to others, near to the world, and even near to God, because it endeavors to describe the things themselves, and in order to return to Husserl's first imperative, rather than to separate reality into abstract concepts. It is because phenomenology is living and speaks of the world of life that it remains relevant. Now, that was pretty much a kind of an introduction to phenomenology. Now I'm using that to move towards the questions related more with this talk, the title of the talk. So in light of all this, the main questions I would like to try to address here are the following. What is the relationship between the invisible and the visible? Are there different kinds of invisibility? And can the invisible be seen as an image? Note that the first two questions are interlinked and will be addressed together, as the different kinds of invisibility also suggest a relationship between the invisible and the visible. Okay, so the word invisible here can imply various ideas, such as something hidden or some concept underlying conditions of possibility, or consciousness. It could also be the unconscious mind, essence, interiority, or even perhaps more centrally spirituality. It is typically distinguished from what is apparent, bodily, quantifiable, visible, and empirical. And in many ways, the history of thought can be somewhat mapped out as trying to square this relationship. At times, this results in either privileging of one over the other, or in extreme cases, one side negating or oppressing the other. Let's start with the first kind, what I'm here referring to as visible invisibility. We usually imply this kind of invisibility in our day-to-day lives. For example, we see the people we meet, yet we do not see their feet if they are wearing shoes, since they are hidden from us. In this ordinary way of speaking of something invisible, we mean that something could be shown to us at some point and become visible. Thus, in this sense, being invisible entails a temporary state of something hidden before being brought into sight, or view, as something already there but concealed, and hence only temporarily invisible, or temporarily out of sight. Similarly, when we look at an object, like a chair, we have a specific profile from a particular point of view. From that standpoint, the rest of the chair remains temporarily hidden and invisible to us, the perceiver. The moment we move around it and act upon that hiddenness, a new profile is captured, which was previously temporarily invisible, but now is visible. However, this new profile is acquired at the expense of losing others, which now become hidden and invisible. This highlights our condition as never being able to see things in their totality, but only partially, depending on our spatial relation to the object. This constant shifting from the visible to the invisible, or from presence to absence, is directly linked to our sense of sight. What all these instances have in common is that they describe a provisional or temporal state of invisibility. That is the transference from the temporally invisible to an equally temporally visible, and vice versa. This invokes a passage such that one can always return to the former, this continuous play, right? However, the question is this the only kind of invisibility possible? There seems to be another particular reality that seems to subsist in a condition of hiddenness or invisibility, which does not and cannot lose its status of invisibility. And this is the second kind, number 2 that is, which I'm referring to here as radical invisibility. The difference between these two kinds of invisibility can be further understood in light of Jacques Derrida's distinction in his work, The Gift of Death, between what he calls visible invisible and absolute invisibility. For the first kind of invisibility, in line with what I have just said before, he states that it is, quote here, an invisible of the order of the visible that I can keep secret by keeping it out of sight, such as my heart, my kidneys, my blood, my brain, are, one says, naturally invisible, but they are still of the order of visibility. Why? Because an operation or accident can expose them to the surface. Their interiority is provisional. Their invisibility can be promised or proposed to sight. However, there seems to be a kind of radical invisibility which entails something wholly other than the visible, precisely as a radical otherness, or as Emmanuel Levinas also claims in his work Otherwise Than Being, an invisibility which, quoting here, is not the invisible taken to be behind the visible. Invisibility in this radical sense entails a face-to-face encounter with transcendence received from beyond the visible structures of appearing. What you're seeing on the slides, there are 3 books by late 20th century French phenomenologists who have made significant contributions to the issue of invisibility and the image in art. And this is where I'm moving towards more tackling the title of this talk, this issue of the image of the invisible. These are 3 very important works, amongst others, obviously. I'll just briefly go through them. A common theme which is found in all these 3 works is that art is meant to lead us back to the source, that is, the invisible, which remains irreducible to the visible, but works through it. Here, a common concept in the work of art is that of the call, which redefines our relationship with art, shifting from detached observation to deep responsive engagement. Rather than seeing a painting, sculpture, or music as an object merely to be analyzed or consumed, we are invited to consider it as something directly addressing us. This event summons us to listen, feel, and answer as well. In this sense, art speaks, it beckons, and demands something from us. This call is not always verbal or even conscious. It can be a steering, a resonance, or a disruption that awakens us to beauty and suffering. If the work of art is a call, then we are not passive recipients, but interlocutors. This call cannot be controlled or predicted. It arrives as a gift, often surprising us with its timing and intensity. By emphasizing the relational nature of art, truly engaging with a work is not about mastering it, but about letting oneself be mastered by it, hence to be moved, even changed by this encounter. Therefore, art becomes a space where dialogue occurs between the visible and the invisible, the temporal and the eternal, where neither one loses its status, but they remain distinct. Now, this is where I'm bringing up the distinction between the idol and the icon here. Distinguishing between the idol and the icon is necessary and helpful to better understand what is at stake here. The idol remains trapped in the visible space as an object to be seen. Nothing else apart from itself can be seen. It is that which stops, delimits, arrests the gaze, and in so doing imposes a demarcation within the person with that which is seen. The idol blocks seeing beyond itself, bounded by the limit of the observer's gaze. It is a mirror representing things that are seen. The source of the idol is the world, and we are its original models. On the other hand, the icon resists such an idolatrous view of the image. It does not give us what we already see, but what makes seeing possible. Its source is not visible, but invisible, which makes things in the world visible. That is why the icon does not result from a visual experience, but provokes one, as a call from the other side. It is not made visible, but points towards the invisible. Whereas the idol results from the gaze that aims at it, the icon summons sight in letting the visible be saturated with the invisible. The icon never reduces the invisible to the visible, but respects it as sacred. This is a quote by Jean-Luc Marion from his work God Without Being, which I mentioned earlier. His first chapters are on this distinction between the idol and the icon. I read a quote here from him. The icon summons the gaze to surpass itself by never freezing on a visible, since the visible only presents itself here in the view of the invisible. The gaze can never rest or settle if it looks at an icon. It always must rebound upon the visible, in order to go back in it up the infinite stream of the invisible. In this sense, the icon makes visible only by giving rise to an infinite gaze. Now, allow me to make a very simple explanation here, which I'm sure most of you are very familiar with. The distinction between linear and reverse perspective, which I think will help us better understand what I said so far. In traditional Western art, as we all know, linear perspective, pioneered during the Renaissance, aims to replicate the world as the human eye sees it. This is the one on the slide which is on the left. It organizes space to a single vanishing point, drawing the viewer into a fixed position and implying a stable objective reality. This perspective reflects the philosophical foundations of modernity, and which is an emphasis on rational observation, linear time, and a detached subject. The viewer becomes a passive observer, positioned outside the scene, looking in. In this framework, art serves as a mirror of nature, governed by the rules that strive for realism and visual coherence. As already noted, phenomenology seeks to move beyond this modern view by emphasizing instead givenness, invisibility, expression, lived time, the call, and participation. Phenomenology seems to point us towards another kind of perspective, which is also known as a reverse perspective, which is on the slide, the right-hand side of the slide, which is often found in Byzantine and Eastern iconography, which positions the vanishing point outside the painting, sometimes seemingly behind the viewer as it projects the scene outward, almost confronting the observer. This perspective destabilizes the modern notion of objective reality and suggests a relational participatory view of existence. Reverse perspective challenges the primacy of visibility by favoring a spiritual or symbolic dimension of experience. It implies that truth is not simply out there to be discovered, but arises in the dynamic interaction between the viewer, the image, and what lies beyond. Perhaps to better understand these two different perspectives, I also included an example of a chair. As you can notice, the lines of perspectives flow in these different directions. Now, in Cézanne, for example, also known as the father of modern painting, the modern artistic approach to perspective, exemplified by Paul Cézanne, is often regarded as highly innovative. However, its multiple perspectives remain a sophisticated evolution of linear perspective, rather than a departure from it. While linear perspective relies on a single unified vanishing point, as we saw before, Cézanne's work presents multiple viewpoints within a single composition. Nevertheless, this modern pluralistic approach does not distort the fundamentals of linear perspective. Instead, it amplifies them, capturing the multiplicity of human perception. Nonetheless, the same idea is retained. Okay, so now I turn more towards what we really understand by reverse perspective and how is it much more revolutionary than modern art, for example, or at least the beginnings of modern art and the Renaissance art. These are just some examples of icons where reverse perspective is used here. Let me just leave it on that slide for now. To such an extent that it is mostly in pre-modern art that we can better understand reverse perspective, in fact, which is far more revolutionary. This technique is primarily found in religious icons, challenging modern modes of visual perception. Unlike the linear perspective we saw, where objects are depicted following the viewer's point of view, reverse perspective directs the viewer's gaze inward and upward towards the divine. Perhaps going back to some other examples here as well. This method, used in Byzantine Eastern Orthodox iconography, emphasizes the sacred nature of the figures depicted, creating a visual experience that transcends physical space. In reverse perspective, the lines and proportions seem to bend or converge towards the viewer, often implying that divine and human realms are intimately connected. The disorientation caused by this reverse or perspective invites contemplation, suggesting that spiritual truth cannot be perceived in conventional ways and must instead be experienced through faith and inner vision. Through this subtle manipulation of perspective, religious icons encourage the viewer to reflect on the nature of the divine and the mystical relationship between the material world and the sacred, that is, the visible and invisible dimensions. These religious icons are deeply intertwined with the idea of the invisible divine presence, offering a unique approach to visual art. Icons can be better understood as portals to the sacred, revealing a deeper spiritual reality beyond the visible. They exist in a space that challenges the conventional distinction between the seen and the unseen. In this way, the icon's power to reveal lies not in its material form, but in its ability to transcend ordinary perception, drawing the viewer into a direct, lived experience of the divine. The icon's stillness, devoid of the dramatic illusion of depth or perspective found in modern Western art, invites the viewer into a non-visual experience of contemplation. It encourages an encounter where the boundaries between the viewer and the sacred become blurred, making the icon both a visual object and a means of intimate connection to the invisible. The icon can be seen as an embodiment of the creative tension between the finite and the infinite. Its simplicity, flatness, lack of depth, and absence of perspective function to underscore the impossibility of fully grasping the divine through human perception. It reveals and hides, offering a glimpse of the sacred while reminding the viewer of its ineffable nature. The icon does not aim to represent the divine in a naturalistic sense, but by reducing the invisible to the visible, but instead to suggest a presence that transcends visual form. It is a conscious acknowledgement of the limits of representation, embracing the paradox that the most profound truths often elude direct visual capture. This experience invites a deeper mode of seeing that transcends the physical to engage the viewer in a spiritual act of perception where the invisible becomes present. Through this lens, we come to see that the image of the invisible is not a contradiction, but a necessary paradox. It is how we encounter reality, not by possession, but through openness, humility, and the gaze of faith. In exploring the concept of the image of the invisible, then, we find that the very act of perceiving art is in many ways an exercise in attention, an attention that goes beyond the simple act of looking. The French philosopher Simone Weil offers profound insights into this process, urging us to recognize attention as a negative effort, a concept that demands a deliberate suspension of our usual mental activity. According to Weil, proper attention is not an act of willful seeking or imposing preconceived notions onto the world, but rather a process of releasing our egoistic desires and preconceived notions. It is precisely a reversal, a turning away from our habitual rush to control and interpret, allowing the mind to become a receptive space open to the purity of the object as it presents itself. In the context of art, the shift of focus is crucial. We are invited not merely to see, but to wait. The state of attentiveness involves a deep cultivation of receptivity, where the mind becomes ready to receive the truth of the object in its pure form. Therefore, in conclusion, we can dare say that art can be seen as an invitation to engage with what is invisible. This allows us to perceive the layers beneath the surface and to encounter the source of art, not through the lens of our desires or judgments, but through an openness that allows the image to penetrate and transform us. I believe that this suspension of thought, waiting without seeking, and the lack of mastery are powerful approaches to understanding art. It demands a release of our usual ego driven pursuits and instead calls us to engage in the intimate, humble act of simply receiving, allowing the invisible to reveal itself. This practice illustrates how art can invite us to participate in the unfolding of supernatural beauty. In contemplating the image of the invisible, we are now not merely engaging with objects of sight, but with thresholds of encounter, where the visible becomes a vessel for the invisible. The icon does not simply depict, it beholds. It returns our gaze not as a mirror, but as a window into a deeper reality. In this reversal, we encounter an aesthetic and ontological truth that the deepest seeing is never possessive, but receptive. Art, when it transcends representation, becomes a revelation. The icon is not a photograph of the invisible, but a participation in the divine gaze. In this liturgical vision, matter becomes luminous and the invisible finds form not to be grasped, but to be welcomed. Thus, the image of the invisible is not a contradiction, but a calling. It invites us to see differently and allow beauty to become a mode of truth. In this light, the icon, and by extension all authentic art, ceases to be an object and becomes an event, a silent epiphany where the divine bends towards our sight and our vision is awakened to wonder. In turn, this attitude, adopted from art, transforms us in the way we perceive our world, ourselves, and others. Thank you for your attention. That's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert, for the presentation. It was really interesting. We have now time for discussion, questions, and comments. Whoever have any comment or question could write on the chat in English or in Portuguese. We do the translation at the time. Meanwhile, I would like to instigate this discussion with some comments. Let's see if I can put it here. So, right now, let me see. So, like, just provocative. You said that all the matter about the phenomenological approach to our arts has more to do with listen and waiting and being in the substance touch by the art that you finish the reception, not the possession of something, right? So I'd like to ask you if this we don't have the risk to become the aesthetic experience purely subjective, if there is a problem with it, and if not, so if there's a problem, how could we make this sort of the universal subjective experience, like in art?
Yeah, very, very good question. You're right. Phenomenology has been criticized for that to some extent, obviously. for its emphasis on subjectivity, and therefore, yes, are we in a position, or are we risking becoming overly subjective? And by that, obviously, we mean becoming isolated, because pure subjectivity ends up isolating us from each other. And as you rightly mentioned, we cannot claim some universality, some objectivity. But I think what phenomenology does is rather holds or beholds what we know objectively. So the emphasis here is on adding another layer, on not moving or not eradicating this universality, this objectivity, but understanding that this is not merely something which has to do with some kind of detached view. In a sense, phenomenology throws us into this light of truth. So in a way, what happens here, this is the paradox, and I think this takes us even back to Kierkegaard, who was obviously before the 20th century phenomenology, but some phenomenologists regard him as a proto-phenomenologist, because he speaks about this somewhat paradoxical claim, but I don't think it is, that truth is subjectivity. What he means by that is that it's not an abstract thing, therefore detached, and therefore can be understood completely as a natural thing, but rather it is something we dwell into, we live in. So even though there's the risk, yes, of going to, if we take phenomenology to the extreme, which I think most phenomenologists don't, and would like to retain that border, that limit, but what we need to understand is what phenomenology tries to do is to help us understand our involvement with objectivity. To be fair, there have been different philosophers on the phenomenological spectrum that emphasize subjectivity or not. So there are some who overemphasizes, others less so, obviously. But so in a way, phenomenology is not just this subject which is driven by one way of thinking, right? But what it's at the very bottom of all these ideas of the school of thought is that this truth is a call which we respond to, and that's what makes it subjective. In a way, that call and response in itself is also a universal call and response, but the way I respond to it is also something which is subjective and has to be retained. Yes, and I think phenomenology does bring that into the picture. But pure subjectivity, I think the majority of phenomenologists would find that problematic. So yes, it's a very valid criticism, but I think phenomenology tries its best to not lead us to that kind of direction, so much so that it speaks more about intersubjectivity rather than pure subjectivity. So yes, there's still universality to it as well.
Thank you very much, Robert, for your answer. Meanwhile, when you are arguing that, I was formulating and searching some examples of it, and it's for me it's quite interesting because you talk about the you said on the inverse, when you talk about inverse perspective, you said about seeing beyond and not much more about the suggestion and not exactly the representation of something, but what we can see that lies beyond the image, like the structure, a skeleton, the invisible, as you said. I'm claiming this because in 2-3 weeks we have a conference from a colleague from Brazil. She's from Federal University of Bahia, and the title of her presentation is Kandinsky, a Neoplatonist in the Modern Art. And it's, for me, it's quite interesting to see, well, since you brought the icon and the Andrei Rublev painting, the Sacred Family. And my question will be, if you see, how do you see this it's quite interesting for me because we have Network Kandinsky, and we wrote on the spirit of art, and we talk about what we like beyond the invisible, as we can say, and also when we read Andrei Tarkovsky, Sculpting Time, is talking about the something that is lies beyond the image, this kind of as you were spiritualist school and Russian artists and Orientalist artists. So I'd like to ask you if how you see first the relation, if there is something related with Kandinsky and Tarkovsky and this kind of art, and the second point will be what will be the difference and the connection, and if there is a necessary connection between representing the invisible in art and being moved by it, because as you see how you understand this relation. I don't know if I make it clear.
Can you repeat the second part, please? Representation and
when you see the connection and the difference, the links between representing the invisible and being moved by it.
Oh. Okay, so yeah, you're very right. And so after Cézanne, then of course modern art progresses, and then we have some further radical. And I think there was a moment when something particular happened which ruptures. In a way, Cézanne is a continuity of sorts, but I think the rupture happens mostly through Kandinsky and others, obviously. But Kandinsky is definitely one which who completely overturns the idea of representation. And as you know, Kandinsky wrote not only depicted but also wrote about his works of art, and in a way creates this language, this spiritual identity to his works of art. And I think he borrows quite a bit from the icon, but obviously secularizes it. So what he does, I believe, is he takes this idea of flatness, lack of naturalism is completely naturalism here I mean by any natural representation is completely rejected or removed from Kandinsky's paintings, and instead what we find is essences, kind of, as you rightly point out, more of a kind of a Neoplatonic concepts or ideas, or in a way forms as well. So Kandinsky, I think, borrows from iconography, the tradition of reverse perspective from the tradition of the icon, but obviously then that's something radically different. He's not interested, doesn't seem to be interested in a way a personal experience. Kandinsky seems to be more interested in more of a kind of a mathematical experience, more like a kind of an abstraction. And icons, abstraction wouldn't be the right word, right? So abstraction is happening in Kandinsky's work, but not in the icon itself. The icon in a way is drawing us to it. In Kandinsky's work, we are faced with this radical dimension, which is neither, well, it is spiritual according to Kandinsky, but definitely not rooted in a particular tradition. So I think Kandinsky's language is quite modern. I haven't thought too much about the link between the reverse perspective and Kandinsky. I find him not to be kind of neither nor, but he does borrow from the reverse tradition to some extent, obviously for obvious reasons, because obviously he studied next to the and within this tradition, but then obviously creates such a radical language and landscape which moves beyond the concept of the icon, and we no longer speak of a sense of a face or a kind of a relationship. The second point, and it's very interesting that you mentioned this, the connection between the representation of the invisible and the idea of being moved or perhaps being transformed, right? First of all, the representation of the invisible is a bit of a problematic term, and I use the word image instead. Representation would, in my view, and I think Michel Henry would agree with me because I actually studied him, not the other way around, obviously, but representation seems to reduce the invisible back to the visible. So the image in many ways is much closer to a kind of respectful space. Representation tends to always reduce and therefore bring back to the visible space. And I think this is what happens in modern art here. By modern art, we mean 15th century art onwards. Now, being moved or transformed, I think in representative art, there is a steering of emotions, definitely, and we can find this in many different movements throughout history, the 17th, 18th century, etc. And so there is definitely a sense of movement going on within the self. But in many ways, it still reflects our own selves. In many ways, it repeats it repeats what we are and what we do or what we could do. In a way, it's never an opening towards the beyond, which is then welcomed as something, as an epiphany or something which is a surprise. I think in representation, what we are faced with is more of a kind of a mirror image of what we already have. And therefore, transformation is limited to that space. Whereas I think in the icon, transformation is more profound, more deeper, because it opens up a different space, which is nothing of the world in a sense. There's something about it which is never reduced. It's reducible to the world. And therefore, I think that is a much more powerful art or powerful image or powerful symbol that can help us be attuned to something different, something beyond the world we know, let's say, and which we always we are familiar with, right? So yeah, I think transformation can happen on both levels, but I think it's much more profound when it deals with an opening to this world beyond the work of art, rather than a work of art being a kind of mirror back and forth of the world we inhabit. Yeah, so I think that is the pointing of the icon towards something which is the source of painting itself. I'm not sure if I'm replying or beating the bush here, Romulo, but I'm thinking as on the spot, and I'm enjoying this, but I don't want to stretch this too far. So please stop me. And if obviously help me if you need clarification or if I'm not being clear.
No, thank you very much. You made me remember some, and that will be if there is a echo or resemblance from the idealist / romanticism from Schelling, when he said that a work of art is the presentation of the concrete presentation of the absolute, and this bridge, and this the particular with the a concrete form of that represents of the resemblance, the absolute, the pure idea. That's quite
Yeah.
so brief. And in your answer, you already answered another question that was put here, and from a colleague, that if the image can show us the invisible, what exactly are we seeing, or could we even, with some sense, talk about it, or I believe, are we in the helm of the speakable also, the invisible, the specific, unspeakable?
Yeah, it's a very, 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 very good question. Michel Henry has a book which is influenced, or rather influenced, but also about Kandinsky, tied to seeing the invisible. But there, what he does is problematizes this question of seeing, in fact. I prefer Chrétien's listening to the invisible, or listening to the work of art. And I think the shift here is happening. So visible is better perhaps understood not through the use of perception, perhaps, but rather to the use of impression, that it impresses itself on us. And I think the icon does that job, in a sense that we are not really seeing something. Seeing remains, in a way, trapped within the world of the object. The call precisely transcends the seeing as a kind of invitation to move beyond the limits, the perhaps confines of seeing, and therefore become tuned, perhaps through other senses, to this invisible, which is, in a way, can never be reduced to the visible, but it's hinted at or finds itself, your channels itself through certain images, which are authentic in the sense that they are attentive to what matters, rather than just simply depicting, again, a kind of a representation of the world, but rather a vehicle towards something which is itself not another seeing, but a kind of a listening, or an impression on the whole dimension of the body and the mind. And I think this is what phenomenology does. It even though it's, I mean, in phenomenology you find lots of emphasis on seeing and perception, but it also moves beyond that as well. Perception is not the be and all in phenomenology, and it allows us to think more on the level of other senses as well. And it also shifts from the mind to the heart, for example, as well, which is also a different way of being and in tune. In the question, there was another part, which I can't remember. I don't know if you can show it again. Yeah. Okay. So, are we saying that the invisible is unspeakable? Can we say something about the invisible? This is a very interesting debate which goes beyond phenomenology, as you know, going back to the Middle Ages, for example. As you know, the famous debates where can we speak about the invisible through analogy, for example, as a kind of a likeness. And I think what the icon does is precisely provides us a kind of a likeness. So in a way, it is a hint of the invisible. The symbols are not completely unreliable. They have something truthful to the invisible, but nevertheless are never contained or never completely reduce it to itself. But saying about the invisible becomes highly then problematic. And I think this is where we shift towards more the listening, the feeling, etc. But the possibility of analogy and likeness is possible in the icon effect. And Jean-Luc Marion speaks about this likeness in his first chapters on God without being, in fact. That the icon precisely does that. It creates this kind of bridge between the visible and the invisible, whereas the idol kind of creates this univocity where it's just one-dimensional in the sense of we are seeing what we already know, what we already have. So there's nothing beyond our seeing. It's just reflected back to us. So yes, I think there is a way of speaking about the invisible artistically, but also philosophically as well, but which nevertheless respects this kind of its immensity, it's precisely without never reducing it to visibility. By visibility, obviously, we also mean our human language. Michel Henry also speaks a lot about these two different kind of languages: the word, what he calls the word of the world, and the word of life. By that he means that when we read, for example, certain sacred text, in many ways they are pointing to us towards another kind of language, what he calls the word of life, which in itself is not reducible to those words, but is contained within something which is far bigger than that. And we also have hints, or we can also kind of manage to create bridges too. So I don't think it's completely impossible, or there's no possibility of a bridge. I think it is possible, as many philosophers have tried to show, but obviously that makes distinction between what kind of art, if we're speaking about art, is authentic art in that regard, right?
Thank you very much, Robert. I also have just one more question, just a person of myself. In conclusion, you said, let me open here, that the deepest seeing is not possessive but receptive, have to do with reception. The art, when transcends the representation, it becomes revelation. My question would be, if this kind of reception it implies or not, whether active reception could, could we learn, or could someone learn to hear, or to listen this hint? If so, there will be a sort of aesthetic. It's possible to talk about an aesthetic phenomenological education, and what will be that? What will be the challenge thereof?
Yeah, very right, very right. So yeah, the distinction obviously between the possessive and the receptive, therefore means again this distinction between what I showed here, the linear and the reverse. In a sense, the linear is always from the point of view of the viewer. So in a way, the image is always the source of the image is always the viewer, whereas the receptive means that the viewer is on the other end, is on the receiving end, right? So you're right. What kind of education would be possible to allow for that possible reversal, I suppose. That's a very broad question, a very, very beautiful one, and I must say, I suspect phonology is one mode of education. In a way, phonology, as you know, can help us because it provides a rigorous method, and in many ways, phonology doesn't stop at, in a way, textbooks or the lecture rooms, right? Husserl from the very beginning spoke about phonology as a way of life. So in a way, adopting the phenomenological attitude, sometimes he calls it the transcendental attitude, but pretty much it's the phonological attitude, is something which is kind of takes us back to the roots of not just philosophy in a way, but also to what it means to be human in a way. And I think it kind of takes us back to this tuning to the environment, to others, to ourselves, but also to what lies beyond, etc. And it kind of reverses again this perhaps modern project of mastery. Phonology does a great job in that, obviously, within the domain of philosophy, and obviously those who work within that domain. In terms of art education, well, I suppose, in a way, having much more spaces where audiences can experience works of art and art in a way that they are, well, let me just take a bracket and a footnote here. I think the problem we adopt today, in my view, is I think we have taken the critical approach and the suspicious approach, which I mentioned earlier in the presentation, a bit too seriously. I think when we approach a work of art or anything, pretty much, we have this sense of suspicion, mistrust. And that's because I think we have perhaps overly emphasized this idea of looking at something or trying to understand something by possessing it, mastering it, and therefore finding flaws, or maybe trying to know it and kind of capture its totality. And I think this is, you're right, a revolutionary education where we have to understand how we can move beyond this attitude. And art, I think, artists more specifically, can help us in that regard if artists themselves not only create works of art where it's, again, not just an object or a decorative piece, but a vehicle, a means of understanding something which is beyond the artist and our context, but also the right space where we can start perhaps being more attuned to these realities, which are both found in the artistic world, but also beyond it as well. So it's no longer perhaps a museum question in the case of the visual arts. Educating the mind, I suppose, is what philosophy does and has been doing since time immemorial. But yes, it is. It requires quite a long time, I suppose, and radical transformation in education, as I think you understood you well, where we, in a way, go back, as Husserl spoke about the thing itself, but by that he means going back to a world which is much more rich, much more overflowing with givenness, as opposed to a world we already possess. Recently at our university, sorry for taking this a bit too far, but we had an American professor at our university, and I had the opportunity to have a meet with him, a discussion in the chat. He's Professor Kevin Hart. He's works in phenomenology, but also in other fields in philosophy, and he's written fantastic books on, for example, recently on contemplation. I mentioned contemplation throughout the presentation contemplation, in a way, as he writes, and I agree with him, is not something reserved to these kind of traditions where you have dedicated people like monks living in a particular space. But contemplation is something which is much more can be learned in a way through time, and it's not something which requires radical transformation in a sense. That it's possible that we become more attuned to these different layers of reality. And I think there is kind of a movement happening in the past decades that even philosophy, but even the work in the arts itself, at least in some spheres, there seems to be a movement towards an alternative to try to reverse things differently, at least to stop focusing too much on perhaps on repeating what we already know.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think that it's a really interesting answer and presentation as a whole. The idea of the contemplation and have to do with what is, I was noted here that they have to do with waiting something, not it's like then the in opposed direction to I don't want to sound wrong, but I just scientific point of view of just a scientific way of see the world. Have to see as you said beyond, and to maybe to understand that, or at least to consider that the mechanical, the scientific, the pragmatical way of conceived not only art but the world as a whole. It's not it's not giving us the full vision of the full package of the situation. I don't know if we have this. The idea of contemplation is something that makes so much sense in this idea, right? So let me see if there. I don't know. We don't have a question here. Let me see the chat if we have it. So we already have a quite minutes for discussion. So I'd like to thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time, for your presentation, to being part of this conference series, and that you have enriched it with a talk. We have already we have some colleagues following on YouTube, and it will remain online, so we have to keep in touch. And for those who are watching and here and on internet, we'll have the following conference the next week, I believe. Yes, the 4th July. We have from the colleagues from France, Cécile Angeline. He'll talk about the contemporary art and judgment, learning how to question, learning to question how we evaluate art. And he'll talk about, I believe she will talk about in the same direction what we took into account when we judging art and what is at stakes here. And the next question, and the following weeks we'll have the presentation as I already said about Maria Fernandes, about Kandinsky and Neoplatonism. But once again, thank you, Robert, for your time and your presentation. And
thank you very much. And thanks all to those who joined in, and keep this going because it's a fantastic idea, and it's a very good way of also creating some networking as well. Thank you very much. Well done.
Thank you.